Hi, I'm Kate Lindley. I'm a psychologist, a coach, a social sciences researcher, a narrative therapist. I am both Swiss and English, and I live in the Swiss French part of Switzerland. And I am here to talk to you today about coaching mothers as a social process. And I'm just going to start showing you my slides. So, welcome to my talk about coaching as a social process for mothers. And I am talking in the defense of mothers. First of all, my gratitude for those who are kindly supporting me in the BPS Coaching Psychology Chartership Accelerated route. Thank you for you who are listening to me talk about all of this. For the mothers who have worked with me either in groups or on their own. For my mother and my children, helping me to understand that being a mother is one of the most demanding jobs. And for all of those giants on whose shoulders I have wobbled, and some of them I will talk about in my talk. So, when I talk about mothers, I'm talking about a woman who parents or cares in mothering ways, including biological and non biological mothers, stepmothers, adoptive and foster mothers, LGBTQIA plus parents, and mothers of every race, class, culture, ability, and life circumstance with all their complex intersecting experience. I understand that I am from a weird environment. I am a white, educated, privileged person. My experience of motherhood um, has been discriminatory, but um, I know that there are mothers out there who have had far more challenging times, who have suffered far more discrimination than I have. When I talk of mothers, I talk of mothering, and I draw on Sarah Ruddick's maternal thinking um, ideas about the demands of motherhood being the preservation of children, nurturing their growth, and teaching them to be socially acceptable. So when I did this presentation live for some um, coaching psychologists, I asked them, in which situations do you coach, um, mentor, or consult with women who are mothers? And perhaps you are like them. Um, one of the persons said, every person I coach is a mother or a father. Um, One person said the people she supervises, very often they are mothers and they talk about their well being and the social conditions. Another person said she is a grandmother and she is asked for her opinions as a psychologist by her daughter and daughter in law. And another person said that she works in the health and care sector. 75% of the women she are part of the health and care sector. So there are also colleagues. Of course, there are some of our clients, and they're all variations of challenges that women who are mothers face. Of course, there are business situations. So, for some of you who are executive coaches, you will find that um, the women that you are coaching are sometimes mothers. And what we have found is that they're relatively hesitant to talk about their non professional experience as mothers in coaching situations. There are four pillars to my approach, four pillars of theoretical and philosophical ideas. The first one that I am drawing on today is the critical empowering um, coaching approach. And the specific reference that I am making is to Hani Shukri and Elaine Cox's article, Coaching as a Social Process. My social science research was grounded in social and relational constructionism. And so everybody who talks about social constructionism will know that Berger and Luckman wrote their seminal book in 1966. I am more of the Kenneth J. Gergen school because he was my second reader of my PhD in 2013. And so I rely on his work quite a lot. I am a trained narrative therapist, and of course, I draw on White and Epstein and White himself, but there are lots of other people in that field that I draw on. And when it comes to matrix-centric feminism, I draw specifically on Rich, Adrienne Rich, Sarah Ruddick, and Andrea O'Reilly. And I've only written one reference to her books, but Andrea O'Reilly is really one of my heroes. So my background or why I am talking about this is I wrote a PhD dissertation and I worked together with the Taos Institute, specifically Sheila McNamee and Kenneth Gergen. Um, and I finished my PhD in 2013. It's an autoethnographic study of my experience as a mother from 1984 to 2004. And it plunged me into the language of social and relational constructionism, dominant cultural discourses, modern power, technologies of the self, coordinations, and deconstruction. Along my study of my documents and reports and journals and so on, I undertook 5 narrative interviews with mothers of ADHD diagnosed boys to understand how mothers are talked to, which reflect the dominant discourses of motherhood. This work was done in the Swiss French part of Switzerland. So let's just look at that first pillar, coaching as a social process. As Shukri and Cox say, coaching did not arise in a vacuum. It emerged within humanistic psychology and the self-actualization culture. It's grounded in neoliberalism, and it's a Western culture with its focus on performance, individual responsibility, and self-management. Coaching is now part of the personal development market. So coaching also feeds back into society in different ways. It can act as a technology of control, psychologicalizing structural issues, helping employees adapt to norms, individualizing responsibility. But it can also be an enabler of change. It can support agency. And what I am arguing is that it requires critical reflection and more socially responsible leadership. It is historically and culturally produced. Its dominant models, language, and aims reflect the values and power relations of Western society. Coaching participates in reshaping norms, behaviors, and power relations in workplaces and community. I have a long background in corporate training and development, executive coaching, and competency frameworks. And as they emerged in the 1980s, it was quite clear that we were asking people to conform to a certain way that was seen as successful in the Western culture. Um, Coaching is never value neutral or apolitical. It's always entangled in power by either reinforcing dominant ideologies or adopting a critical stance, helping clients question those ideologies and their effects. So, calling coaching a social process is a way of saying every coaching conversation sits inside social structures, gender, class, race, organizational hierarchies, laws, and discourses, and it cannot be understood apart from them. So, Shukri and Coach talk about how cultural diversity and conformism can be looked at. So their model says that cultural diversity can range from absolutism, where there is a set of ideal values and norms, or relativism, um, which is really the belief that values and norms are defined within each cultural setting and that no cultural view has primacy over other views. And then looking at how existing social order is treated, we can be on one side on a continuum of conformism, where it's really preferable to adhere to the accepted values and norms within the social context, and criticality, which is it's preferred to challenge the limitations and seek to change them if necessary to achieve a positive outcome. So they propose four stances of coaches, excuse me. One being denial, which would treat coaching as a value neutral technology, that it assumes universality of coaching models and human motivation, and that it ignores social context, focusing primarily, purely on the person. So this could happen in coaching where some of the research that I have read about coaching, where coaches would prefer not to talk about parenthood or motherhood within, say, an executive coaching situation because it's not seen as relevant. Substitution is a way of recognizing the context, but assumes one set of values, and often Western and individualist, is superior and should replace local norms. Now, you can see behind me, I have a number of books, even dating back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose book about the treatise on education was published in 1762. And who decided to tell mothers how they should bring up their children. I have such a range of books, and there is such a range of values within those books. Um, and very often people will say to me, have you read such and such a book, this book about motherhood? And it will propose a certain set of values. Now, I'm not saying they're right or they're wrong. I'm just saying there's a proliferation of these kind of ways of looking at them. And sometimes as coaches, we might read one book and be so enamored of that approach that we might focus on that. And here we're just recognizing that that's what is happening. Now, the most common approach or stance of coaches that we can see is adaptation. So, whereas the coach will be respectful and will adjust to the local culture, they will also be looking to align coaching with local norms and avoid challenging So this kind of coaching is where I would say, yes, I know you're having a tough time, um, but you've got to bite the bullet. And we'll find ways of increasing your resilience, your self-confidence to be able to handle these issues, but we will never really take a critical look and reflect on the issues that mothers or anybody could be facing. So, integration and criticality, the fourth stance of coaching, which is what Shukri and Cox are talking about and are saying this is what we need to develop, is a way of respecting and understanding the client's context. So there's no whitewashing. There's no saying to mothers, oh, yes, but mothering is so wonderful. It brings so much satisfaction and so on. No, motherhood is sometimes really difficult. So is parenthood, um, fatherhood, and sometimes really quite difficult. Um, and let's look then critically and examine the norms, the power, and oppression that is in the client's context that that person is being submitted to. And it supports them to change their reality where possible. So it's not asking people to stand up and be the first to talk out and take the heat. It's saying, what could you do at what level? How comfortable would you feel? And how does that link to what is important to you? So I've already more or less talked about this. Denial coaching treats motherhood as a purely individual matter, focusing on goals, mindset, and performance while ignoring structural, cultural, and institutional factors. Substitution, the coach imposes their own preferred model of empowered or healthy motherhood as superior to the client's cultural or personal norms. And while this can feel liberating at first, it risks replicating an expert driven stance. I talked about Rousseau, where mother's own meaning making is marginalized. Um, in adaptation, the coach understands, respects the mother's context, helps her to adjust or cope better with within existing norms. It's more culturally sensitive, but it may leave oppressive structures unchallenged, and it normalizes impossible expectations. And boy, do we know about that. In that fourth stance, the coach honors the mother's context and values while inviting critical reflection on dominant discourses, powers, and inequality. And the aim is to support mothers to find responsive that preserve their dignity and agency without denying risk or complexity. So, what does this mean for coaches? This means that they need to, they must, they should, they are invited to develop a deeply critical stance, which includes the study and understanding. So, social, cultural, and political awareness, possibly tailored to specific relevant contexts. And what I am inviting you here to do is to understand some of the research, some of the studies that are done on motherhood, so that if you are coaching mothers, that you will understand more and look for more information on what it is really like within that social, cultural, and political context. Also to understand, to develop a critical stance about psychological concepts that relate to oppression and empowerment. There are some feminist psychologists that will state the claim that psychology is a patriarchal theory. So you could look at that. And then also to be able to facilitate a critical dialogue with their clients. So how is it that we can talk about those things in a way that will bring out their agency and facilitate their action in challenging social contexts. So, theories such as feminism, critical multiculturalism, social constructionalism, postmodernism, or post colonial theory should be incorporated into the study of coaching. I'm not saying that it absolutely has to, I'm saying that in order to develop a critical stance, these are some of the things that we could look at. And then, of course, if you're not coaching mothers, but say you're coaching fathers, there's massive things to look at there. So my PhD that I completed in 2013. Like I've already said, it's an autoethnographic study of maternal experience. It's my personal story along with a cultural analysis. It has a social constructionist perspective under the guidance of Kenneth Gergen and Sheila McNamee, two of my giants, and an understanding of how those with power in society construct dominant discourses, which form the basis of social norms and expectations. It's what Foucault called modern power. Um, Interviewing mothers with children diagnosed with ADHD and asking them, what messages did you receive? How were they helpful? When were they not helpful? And how did you react to that? And what did you learn since becoming a mother? Um, in a methodology that we call narrative interviewing, led me to see that what mothers were affected the most by was professionals, the way professionals talk to them. So in rare cases, they talked about families, family members, loved ones, even their partners, the fathers of their children, making remarks about their children and the way that they mothered their children. But what had a real impact was the way professionals, both educational and medical, including psychiatric and psychological professionals, talked to them, and created the effects of isolation, a sense of exclusion, depression, burnout, and shame, an incredible amount of shame. So what I was looking at as doing a deconstruction of those discourses, whose ideas, where did these ideas about motherhood come from? When and where did they arise? So we all know that Rousseau was French and Swiss. He lived not so very far away from me, from where I live right now. It was in the 18th century. And what were the societal values that person? I could talk for hours about Rousseau, and what I consider his values. But who was not listened to? Whose voice was not heard? And what are the social consequences of this idea? So it's really taking a big picture view. So social or relational constructionism a la Gergen. So here I am, I'm talking to you about the different methodologies that could feed into developing a critical stance in coaching. Gergen uh, became quite unpopular when he wrote his thesis about social psychology as history. I think it was in 1972. He wrote that theories are context bound and not timeless laws. Psychological theories and findings change the very behaviors they describe because they carry prescriptive messages. And that is the construction part of social construction. Anything we say, we could relate it back to Searle's speech act theory. Anything we say isn't just out there and has no influence on people. What we say does have an influence. It does something. And so when we say, this is what a good mother should be, it's prescriptive and it creates that language and the way that we talk about mothers. So psychological concepts are value laden and ideological, and they're not neutral. They cast some traits as deficient and propagate particular ideals of the good person. So heed the call to rethink the aim of practice, is what Gergen was saying, and still is saying. Psychology should function as a synthesizing, that's a difficult word for me to say, and generative enterprise. Clarify how we make sense of ourselves now and offer new ways of understanding that can reshape social life. For those of you who are perhaps in the world of organizational development, appreciative inquiry that was developed by David Cooper-Ryder comes under the umbrella of social constructionism. David Cooper-Ryder was one of the founders of the Taos Institute. So that is for social constructionism. I am going now into matricentric feminism, and I'm talking about the long history of mother blame. So one of the books I recently read, which is not really in my primary area of interest, is Mary Beard's book. And in it, she talks about how Penelope is told off by her son and told to go to her room and told to keep her ideas to herself. So that goes back some thousands of years. Elizabeth Badinter wrote about how St. Paul contradicted Jesus's message of equality between husband and wife, asserting male dominance. Ehrenreich in English, and there's lots of other women. There's Sylvia Federici, Mona Chollet, who have written about the witch hunts in the 15th century that laid waste to women's work of healing. That's tied in with the Enlightenment movement that came out and that Jean-Jacques Rousseau belonged to. He came up with the idea of the modern family founded on mother love. Blaffer Hardy in her book about maternal instinct talks about the neo-Darwinist Spencer, who claimed the physiological division of labor by sex in the 19th century. So therefore saying women merely reproduce, and so let's just make sure that they are confined to the home and to doing that. In the 1920s, child guidance in America developed the concept of maternal pathology. That was written by Jones in 1999. And Kaplan and Hall McQuarrie, no, that's the name I can't pronounce, but Paula Kaplan studied I think there were, she looked at 3 particular years of clinical journals, major clinical journals, and she came up with 125 articles that talked about mothers. One article mentioned a father. And within those articles, there were 7 different psychopathologies that were attributed to mothers. And Kaplan then went on to write another book about, which is entitled Don't Blame Mother, where she talks about her personal experience of being a psychiatrist and listening to her colleagues talk badly about mothers, and she decided to do something about it. So there is a long history of mother blame. There's loads of feminist literature that dates right back, and there are lots of names. And if you would like to have a copy of my slides, you can write to me and I will send them to you. So there you can see that there is now a proliferation of women writing about motherhood, and there's also research being done on mothers. So this proliferation has come about, but initially there was a lack of research in mothering experience, which was due to two factors. One was the low status of parenthood in general and of motherhood in particular in the Western culture, and that the Western society has a historical tradition of silencing mothers. And 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 that we can see by the fact that most of research about child development that gave certain that established certain norms about mothering were mainly written by men. So when I looked at how professionals were speaking to mothers, I I could talk to you about two instances. One is my experience as a mother, and this was an important experience because it led me to start studying psychology, to start studying social science, and to start studying motherhood. I was called in to see the head of the private primary school with my ex-husband, father of my son. And my son had changed from the Swiss French speaking school to an English speaking environment. And the school culture was very different, and he was not adapting. My son was later diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia and other things later on, a genetic syndrome. But I was harassed by, when I got there, I was harassed by the school psychologist um, who kept on going at me, saying that I didn't understand how dire the situation was. And it was when I finally broke down in tears that she said to me, "Aha, finally we get to see the mother who cares." And later on, as a narrative therapist, I had Mary, the mother of a boy diagnosed with ADHD, who consulted me. And she had asked to talk to the child psychiatrist who had been seeing her son for some time. Um, she wanted to know about the progress that her son was making because she found that her son had not changed. In fact, her life was a little bit more difficult since he had starting seeing this child psychiatrist. And one of the things she had to do was take Wednesday afternoon off to take her son to his sessions. And the psychiatrist said to her that as long as Mary, would not do the work on her own psychological problems, her son would not get better. And this was something that I have seen over and over again, where mothers who are having difficulties with institutions like schools and are having difficulty making themselves heard, asking for adjustments to be made for their children, very often they can be told that they're obviously hysterical and they need to do some work on themselves. And that is where I think coaching and narrative therapy can really be so much different because it's shorter and it focuses on what the person needs to get done right now. And that is what Mary needed to do. She needed to position herself differently with this psychiatrist and make changes. So when I was looking at when I was interviewing the mothers who had children diagnosed with ADHD, nobody told me about being overwhelmed as a mother. They really they told me about how happy they were. They had these active little boys who were running around and jumping off um, springboards and things like that, that they were really very happy to have a child with so much energy. And then there were surprises and there were worries because people in the family might say something about their child being out of control. Um, and then they took their child to school or to daycare center, and there the remarks started happening. There people started saying things to them, and they started getting worried. And they decided to maybe find out more information, go and see their GP to find out was there something perhaps different that they needed to know about their child. And what we can see, or what I saw in those interviews, is how the guilt and the self blame, uh, fathers who said, well, you're the mother, you should understand what's wrong with our child. And so it was obvious that the discourse about a mother being solely responsible for her child and their outcomes was really weighing heavily on them. And what I found is that they started to isolate themselves. They started to decide to exclude themselves from social settings, maybe with their family, but also they wouldn't go willingly to school with their child. They didn't want to stand around and have other mothers and fathers talk about them. They really tried to avoid teachers. Um, they avoided certain medical professionals, and that is shame. And that was really deeply anchored and led to feelings or a sense of depression, helplessness, and in some cases, burnout. And after being there for a while, and maybe some of them had contacted um, a a patient organization for kids with ADHD, maybe they got the diagnosis of ADHD, and then they started to get fed up. And then they started to show resistance. And as time went on, they thought about what strategies they could actually use. So I could tell you multiple stories, and some of them are quite funny, um, but some of them are quite hard to listen to, about how they stood up for themselves, how sometimes they got it wrong, but they really thought about it. One mother said to me she camped outside the teacher's room until the teachers listened to her at the beginning of every autumn term. And then it was really amazing. It was like they started out, I like little mice, and they became lionesses as they transformed, and they started to become advocates for other mothers. So that is that is what I studied and how I saw. And if I go actually back to that slide, I don't know at what point in time you might see a mother, whether her child is diagnosed or not, because we know that social media, there's a social norms right now are making mothers feel that they're not good enough. They're blaming themselves for perhaps poor educational outcomes and so on. But what I found is that um, their depression, their shame, their burnout was a function of the social context that they were in, and not because They had some inherent mental illness or mental health. Definitely, they had a mental health issue, but they were suffering from the context. And so, what we can see is that whether it's social constructionist or narrative perspective, what is out there I will integrate, I will take on because that is what the society is telling me that is normal. So those value-laden stories and theories are propagated throughout society through discourses and norms. So it's a form of modern power because you can't always say it's just one person. Um, but what happens is that people will be positioned. That is a term that we use quite a lot in social constructionism. We say people are positioned. So when I was at work, I was called Mother Lindley by some of my male colleagues. So that is, I mean, that's an obvious form of being positioned. Here you are. You are now no longer Miss Lindley or Mrs. Lindley, you are now Mother Lindley. And so we are positioned, and good mothers do this, and good mothers don't do that. And those norms are internalized. So what we're working with is a set of internalized norms. You could say that they're limiting beliefs or that they're, say, dysfunctional thoughts. But they're not just individual. They're not just personal. They belong to a, a, a wider part of society. So, narrative therapy is one of the therapies that can work in a critical coaching practice. There are particular ways of looking at people in narrative therapy which are not commonly found in widespread psychology. And one of the things that is most probably the best known is that we say problems are not located solely inside persons. So I've just talked about how it is that we internalize norms, and those norms become problematic. And what we say is the problem is the problem and not the person. The person is not the problem. So what we will do is, like in a lot of therapies, we will um, externalize or we will take distance from the problem and look at its effects. Now, we know that problems are related through stories, relationships, knowledges, and wider structures of meaning. Um, and so, what we do as narrative therapists is that we privilege lived experience and authorship. We say that the person is the expert of her life. And therefore, I find it, when I started learning narrative therapy, I thought it was quite easy for coaches because yes, we need to deconstruct our own beliefs of what we have of mothers, but we have not been um, instructed through years of academic education into that somewhat patriarchal view that psychology has of mothers. So, and also the way of working in narrative therapy by privileging the person as the expert of her life. I find that coaching is similar. So the practitioner is decentered and influential. She does not occupy the position of primary authority on the mother's life. And that is so different from various forms of psychotherapy, especially psychodynamic therapy. She is influential. The coach, is influential through the questions and inquiries that she asks. So similar to coaching. So from the social constructionist point of view, but also from narrative therapy, we look at deconstructing the ideas that people come along with. I have already talked about that because I said I did it. But narrative therapy has a particular way of asking questions about that that could be really helpful for sort of untangling, unpacking the social norms that are leading to people being feeling that they're not good enough. Um, so how it can work in narrative practice. So this is an example. Imagine this is a dialogue between a practitioner, a narrative therapist, or a narrative coach saying, you have told me about the things that you are doing to make sure that your son gets to school on time. Where did these ideas about what mothers should do to get their children to school on time come from? And what term would you use to describe these things that mothers do? Is there a sort of umbrella term for all these things? And maybe a mom would say, this is about, being a good mom. So I would say then, so when these ideas about how to be a good mom come up, what else do they invite you to do? So let's take a little broader because I might find that um, the ideas, the social norms are telling me to choose my child's clothes, to get my child dressed, to lay out the breakfast table for my child, make sure that he or she has cleaned her teeth, all of these things. And this is really the key point. What are the effects of this striving to be a good mom on you and your relationships? So it might be that I am getting quite tired. I am quite exhausted by all of these things that I have to do. It might create a certain amount of pressure in the family home. It might create difficulty between my child and myself. And we can never take social norms away. They possibly will change with time, but we can't exclude them totally. We live in language. So what we do ask is, do you agree with those effects? And that is really key. Do you agree with those effects? Because usually people will say no. And then we ask, okay, so what does this striving to be a good mom repress? What things that are important to you are not present? And the mom might say, well, I really hope that I would be teaching my child to become more self-sufficient, more independent. And so we can start talking about those things that are important to the mother that are not currently present, and what could she do? And that's where we would look at her agency. What could she do? Could she delegate? Could she, all the different things that she could do. Um, so um, we would look at alternative descriptions for mothers and look at preferred mothering identities. So we would examine what it means to be a good mother from their own point of view or other perspectives. So, for example, a mother who does not clean up her child's room and leaves him to do it is teaching her son about taking care of himself and his belongings. So we would ask questions, or I would ask question, what matters to you here? And what do your actions tell us about the kind of mother you are trying to be? Which descriptions of mothering feel most alive or truthful to you? And what feels right about this? And who else would know that this is important to you? And so we would link to other people's, which strengthens the meaningfulness. So these are the way that we work. So we can externalize mother blame too as a community. And and when I was doing this presentation live, I asked the people who were attending, what forms of mother blame have you personally encountered? And what did it invite you to take up? What message did it tell you about what kind of mother you should be? And how have you resisted it? What does it say, the fact that you resisted, about what is important to you? And tell me a history or the story of how that became important to you. And in the talk, a mother talked about how it was that a teacher had wanted to impose a psychological diagnosis on her child, and how she had resisted that. Um, and so you see, all of us have stories, whether we are professionals or not. We all have stories. Once we are a parent, once we are a mother, we all have stories about how we were positioned, how we were told what was right for our child, and we were not listened to. So, what I just did is I showed you how we can attend to resistance. So, we know that challenging the status quo or institutions, whether it's schools or the health system, can be risky. Um, um, some people, some mothers tell me about stories where um, their children were, say, denied medication, or told that their child did not have ADHD, or told that ADHD did not exist, and they didn't know how to challenge. They didn't know how to challenge that medical practitioner without losing the support. Or they might find themselves humiliated, or they might be punished. Like the next time they call for an appointment, they're told the medical practitioner can't see them for so many months. So if somebody takes, if somebody shows resistance, it's evidence of agency under pressure. And so we would look at that, and it might be very small and barely visible to an observer. A mother may turn away slightly. She might turn her head. She might not answer a question. She might refuse an interpretation. She might say, I don't agree with that. She might decline a recommendation. No, we're not going to go and see that specialist. Or she might ask one firm question again and again and again. She might hold her ground in a meeting. Um, and we don't ask, how did that make you feel? We ask, how did you respond? And what did that mean? What did that mean that you responded in that way? We're not looking at, did it work immediately? Because maybe it didn't work, but we're looking at the sense that was behind what the mother was doing, and we're looking at that, and then we develop that small response into a meaningful value-based action, and that's a richer story of identity. And usually what I hear is any mother who defends her child or her child's well-being is, some of them talk about, I'm a wolf mother, or it's a richer sense of identity that they're talking about and developing and bringing into being. So that's what we do. We thicken the stories, we make them richer descriptions. So we'll be identifying stories of competence, care, and positive intentions. We'll attend to the details of what mothers are already doing. They're intending to do, they're surviving, and they're sustaining, instead of them seeing as deficient. And if there is one thing that you would take away as a professional from this talk, is when a mother tells you, for example, and I tried this kind of diet and it didn't work, ask about all the effort and the time it took to investigate using a different diet, and what it was that led them to do that, and what they tried. And because those are really important things. It's not something to just discard. Oh, well, that didn't work, but did you try CBT? Or something like that. So what we would look for when we're thickening stories is when you have a sense of being able to decide for yourself, where does that sit in your body? So we're anchoring that in the body. So those who do NLP will like that. What metaphor comes to mind when you are able to decide for yourself? Wow, I might be the captain of the ship deciding what course we're going to take. How who um it should be who else knows about that strength that you can show? Who else, maybe your grandmother, maybe your aunt, maybe your mother, knows that you have had a history of wanting to be able to decide for yourself. Where else has that strength shown up in your life? And let's look at that and weave a richer, thicker story. So I have been working with groups of mothers with children who are neurodivergent since 2014, and obviously I advocate for working in groups. Um, and one of the things that it does is it allows them to develop what Kristin Neff in Self Compassion calls common humanity. I am not the only one who goes through this. This is what happened to me personally when I interviewed the five mothers. All of a sudden, I was like, there's a sorority, there's a group of us that go through this. It increases their awareness of how harmful dominant discourses can be maintained by women and develop solidarity amongst women. Of course, we have to address that. Sometimes we are the ones who are sustaining and maintaining negative dominant discourses about motherhood. It helps them to find solutions or ways of responding, asking for support, advocating for their children from other mothers. I'm not the only person who has experience, and I am definitely not the expert. And that is why I have written a facilitation guide called Beyond Mother Guilt, working narratively with groups of mothers that hopefully will be coming out in 2025. It's coming out in September 2026 in French, um, but I don't know if it will be coming out in English in 2025, 2026 or 2027. Um, so in the groups, for example, I asked the mothers to take turns to tell a story of a demanding situation that she handled relatively well, and the others listen for words of competence, good intentions, values, and aspirations. And when the time is up and she's finished telling her story, the mother will hear these words repeated back to her. And they begin to hear themselves differently. They hear about their resourcefulness, their patience, their advocacy, their sense of humor, their persistence, whatever it was. Um, they might have used certain words that don't come up when they're repeated back, but they might also have the opportunity to make sense of what was repeated back to them. And that is so, so heartwarming to see. So, coaching mothers is a social process. I have gone through, I said to you, I had four pillars. I have coaching as a social process. I have social or relational constructionism. I have narrative therapy and matricentric feminism. And all of this brought together is going to help us develop a more critical coaching stance, one of integration and criticality. It will require more study, more reflection, more work. What we can say is it requires more than empathy, encouragement, or goal setting. It calls for this posture that can hold context, discourse, power, and agency together. It means listening carefully for mother blame, both external and internalized. It invites mothers to describe their preferred ways of mothering, their preferred identity. It identifies acts of resistance and recounts moments of competence, care, and discernment that dominant discourses have obscured. It becomes more a conversational practice of solidarity, and it requires humility. Mothers who have children in the UK, you call them SEN children, special educational needs and disability. They are not heroes. They are not victims. They are not saints. So we do not prescribe heroic acts of emancipation. We find forms of response that are possible, ethical and protective in the circumstances. And that's what it would take. And so I invite you to look into more depth about this. And I remain available if you would like to contact me and talk to me more in detail about this. Thank you very much.